Okay, so welcome back for section 5, tracking volunteer impact, which is an interesting thing for me to talk about. But we will go through, you know, me and Kathy, hopefully these days. And everybody that's in our Slack channel that needs to be or wants to be, if you're not, be sure to let Kathy know and we'll get you in there. You can always find the homework in the video from the previous week on our website. And so today's focus, we're going to talk about volunteers for Salesforce and what that means and what is there and what's available, the key objects and features, and then the volunteer interface itself. And Volunteers for Salesforce has been around for a number of years. It was originally designed to manage volunteer relationships at scale and record their interaction with your nonprofit organization. So it's free, it's open source, it's a managed package from Salesforce that is designed to be used in conjunction with the Nonprofit Success Pack. But volunteers come in all shapes and sizes and ages and colors, and nonprofit organizations utilize and engage volunteers in a lot of different ways. Because Volunteers for Salesforce is open source and it's native to Salesforce, it can be configured and customized to fit a myriad of organizational needs. There are several critical distinctions to make to apply the best Volunteers for Salesforce design for a nonprofit. Let's explore some of these specific use cases and see how it might work best for those nonprofit organizations. So volunteers are different, but so are the organizations where they volunteer. I've got a couple here that I'm familiar with that use nonprofit Success Pack and use Volunteers for Salesforce in specific ways. So some prefer a level of control over which volunteers should be assigned to a particular job, or depending on the job, volunteers may be allowed just to assign themselves. Big Brothers Big Sisters is a great example. I've been on their board of directors and know that anytime you apply to be a big brother or a big sister, obviously it's a volunteer position, but there are a lot of hoops to jump through before you are approved to be a big brother or big sister. A background check is usually a part of that, a interview process. So there's an entire application and verification process before you can become a big brother or big sister. So that's a specific use case. Although once you've been approved as a big brother or big sister, you want to be able to track those volunteer hours that they're working, right, with their little brother or sister once they've been matched. Another example is Meals on Wheels. If you're familiar with Meals on Wheels, there is a huge cadre of volunteers that volunteer the same job every week of every year for years and years. And they deliver meals to the same folks. They really develop relationships with the folks where they deliver meals. So it's kind of a recurring volunteer opportunity, right? They don't need to sign up for a different route or a new route every week. They're going to do the same thing week in and week out. And so it's a bit of a recurring job. Sometimes you just need volunteers for events, right? One and done. Come and clean up the highways with us this weekend, clean up the rivers. You know, we don't care who you are, just sign up so we know you're going to be there. Or maybe it is a day of caring where there are lots of different jobs available, and sign up for the specific volunteer job that you want to do. But we need to know your t-shirt size, right? Because you're going to get a t-shirt because volunteers live on t-shirts. Disasters is a completely different situation for volunteers. People want to volunteer immediately after a disaster. And most volunteer organizations are not in a situation to be able to leverage those volunteers until sometimes months after the disaster. So how do you gather information on volunteers who want to volunteer in disasters and then be able to deploy them once you have something for them to do? So all those questions, and sometimes you are managing 100 volunteers, sometimes you're managing 1,000. Sometimes we signed up 1,400 volunteers in a field one day after a tornado, people that wanted to volunteer. But distributing that workload among the volunteers themselves, as well as the volunteer coordinators, provides more time for all the humans to do what only humans can do, right? And because it's all recorded and tracked in Salesforce, then, not for case management, obviously, but volunteers can report on the volunteers, the shifts, the jobs, the hours. Volunteers for Salesforce comes with 32 different reports that you can actually use to see that information and to track that information back out. And with all those different use cases, with all the reporting, what do you have to make that happen in Salesforce? Ironically, it's very little. And Volunteers for Salesforce uses the standard Salesforce lead object, the campaign object, and the contact objects. And we'll talk a little bit later about the campaign object and the challenges that using that campaign object will cause. But those are the three standard objects that Salesforce uses. What Volunteers for Salesforce adds is these 5 other custom objects that make the whole system work. In this case, the lead is the volunteer who expressed interest in a specific volunteer campaign, such as a disaster volunteer, right? We talked about disaster volunteers. Contacts are volunteers who have signed up to perform a specific job or shift. So a contact would be that big brother, big sister who has been assigned to a little brother or sister, right? Campaigns are used to track volunteer engagements. So the campaign is connected to the volunteer job so that we can be able to see what's happening there. So really is only 5 additional custom objects. So thank goodness the architecture is not specifically complicated. There are some additional fields that Volunteers for Salesforce adds to the contact record. So the volunteer status, which you see here, this is a pick list field that contains standard options of active, inactive, new sign up, and prospective. The volunteer hours, you see that here, which is actually a roll-up field where the volunteer's total completed hours are calculated. That happens overnight, like most roll-up fields. The volunteer organization. So if a volunteer is working on behalf of an organization or a company or group, then the information is stored here. Rotary Club is a good example. If you're familiar with them, our local Rotary Club has Rotary readers, and they go to the elementary schools and read with 3rd graders on a regular basis. And so obviously they want their individual information. They want to know how many hours they volunteered, but the local group wants to be able to pull all the Rotary Club volunteer information and see what the Rotary Club as a whole has given back during the school year. Volunteer skills is a multi-select pick list. Don't tell Steve Moe. We don't want to kill any little seals, use multi-select pick list, but we don't have a choice here. So this is a way for volunteers to be able to denote specific skills that they've indicated that they possess, right? The first volunteer date is another standard field. Excuse me. So this is the very first day they volunteered. So if you're looking to reward volunteers they've been a volunteer for a year, they've been a volunteer for 5 years, right? How recently did they volunteer? That's the last volunteer date. So this is the last time they volunteered. And then these other fields are additional fields that can be added in as well. From the campaign standpoint, we also Volunteers for Salesforce also adds a few fields to the campaigns. And mostly it's just sum the data around volunteers into the campaign record itself. They're almost all number fields. So let's take a look at these right quickly. So the number of volunteers, right? So how many volunteers are involved in this campaign is a summing up of all the volunteer jobs. Volunteer completed hours. So rather than how many hours did this specific volunteer complete, this is how many hours did Star Labs assistants have, right? Volunteers still needed. So if I say I need 5,000 volunteers and I still need 2,887 volunteers, obviously I have some work to do, right? Sometimes what's still needed is important to know. Volunteer jobs is a roll-up summary field, and it counts the number of volunteer jobs. So there's only 2 volunteer jobs within this campaign. But volunteer shifts, which is a roll-up summary field that sums the volunteer jobs, the volunteer shifts in this case are 300. And then the volunteer website time zone. This is important. I don't know about you all, but for me, time zones are kryptonite. And if you live in one of those border states where maybe you live in Indiana, but you're going to volunteer in Chicago, and you've got to deal with Eastern time versus Central time, an important thing to know. So the roll-up summary values make it easy to create reports and dashboards to see the level of engagement in volunteer campaigns. Just remember, like I say, they're not instantaneous. They are scheduled to run nightly. So you're not going to know immediately if you filled all the 2,887 volunteers. It'll be tomorrow morning before you know that. So the individual objects here and laying out just a little bit so you can see them. You see how they attach to the campaign. The volunteer shifts are child objects of the volunteer jobs. The volunteer jobs are child objects of the campaign. The volunteer job holds the information about the high-level job itself and has to look up to a campaign. The volunteer shift holds information on date and time specific volunteer jobs and looks up to the volunteer job. The volunteer hours hold the quantitative information on the number of hours that have been volunteered for any given volunteer shift. And then you also have the job recurrence schedule, the job recurrence schedule, and to hold the information on volunteer jobs that happen repeatedly and hold the information on volunteers who sign up for the repeated or recurrent volunteer jobs. So jobs and shifts work together with campaigns to form that underlying framework, which is the basis of it all. The volunteer interface for Volunteers for Salesforce is an interesting situation. There are 2 standard options for the volunteer interface: the website integration and the Experience Cloud. Of course, the important thing is to provide volunteers with an easy-to-use interface so they're engaged as well as they can sign up themselves, which gives your staff a break not to have to be able to do that for them. So there are detailed instructions in the Volunteers for Salesforce documentation concerning what and how you can integrate Volunteers for Salesforce pages into a nonprofit's website. So we'll look at this in more depth in chapter 11 when we get to where we're going to actually configure those interfaces and configure the Volunteers for Salesforce itself. But the short story is you can create an iframe tag and share that with a website developer who will insert it into the nonprofit's webpage. So one of the important things to remember about this is that out-of-the-box functionality does not provide mobile responsive iframes for Volunteers for Salesforce. That's a challenge, right? So unless you've got a developer team who's very astute and can get this work done for you, statistically, 80% of volunteers use anything on their mobile phone. So that's a drawback for using the iframe itself, even in your WordPress or whatever interface you're using. So here is where we come to the challenge with using Volunteers for Salesforce and using, because it has to have campaigns used with it, right? So Volunteers for Salesforce requires partner Experience Cloud licenses, that level of Experience Cloud licenses, if you're going to build it in Experience Cloud, for volunteers, because campaigns are part of that process. And so if you want them to be able to log in, you want them to be able to be identified, you have to go to that top tier of Experience Cloud licensing, right? So there is an additional cost, to buy those licenses, even though you're a nonprofit. There is a new SKU that makes it less expensive, but you do have to purchase licenses either per login or per user for Experience Cloud. And then the additional effort of building out Experience Cloud, which the Experience Cloud interface is another certification altogether, one I don't have. So again, if you have the resources, to build out Experience Cloud, then it definitely can be done. Here's an example of it. But just to be aware of what it takes to build that interface out in Experience Cloud. And of course, shameless plug, right? I always feel strange teaching on Volunteers for Salesforce because our first product that we have is Hands-on Connect, which is not a replacement for Volunteers for Salesforce. It is more of, if you need a distributed model, if you need that volunteer portal or a partner portal, Hands-on Connect provides all of that. And then our new product, Llama Site, this is an example of what we've done with the volunteer interface for Volunteers for Salesforce for the Llama site. So shameless plug, I apologize. Just want you to be aware of it. Obviously, it's not going to be on your certification, not going to be on the test, but to know that it's there. So although Volunteers for Salesforce is really a relatively simple package, it's highly flexible and very customizable so that it can meet several different use cases and business processes that nonprofits have for volunteer engagement and management. Volunteers for Salesforce can automate standard processes such as collecting contact information, providing a dynamic calendar of volunteer opportunities for volunteers to choose from, and sending volunteer notifications. Volunteers for Salesforce is scalable within the standard Salesforce limits of API calls and records. It works best with Nonprofit Success Pack, but it can be a standalone product as well. So in the course of this last 5 weeks, we've covered the big three, right? Donors, programs, and now volunteers. So next week, we are going to take one final look at what else we might need from Nonprofit Cloud from the standpoint of grant making and grants management, and then extended capabilities for fundraising and accounting. And we have homework here, stakeholder engagement with Nonprofit Cloud, engagement plans and levels, which we will get into setting those up when we actually do the configuration, and then actually the managing volunteers for nonprofits. Kathy's got office hours set up for Thursday at 3 p.m. And we will add the video replay link in there when we get it on the webpage.